Everybody. Gosh. Thank you. It's great to be here. Unfortunately, I'm having some slight technical hitches with the presentation. So, Louise, are you able to share that or not? Hopefully, Louise has got the presentation up for us. Very quickly, what I will be covering today will be kind of introduction. Pinging things. I'll be talking about Borderlands Creative People and Places programme, slightly about art and culture and nature and social recovery, but also about the disproportionate impact of COVID. Sorry, I still can't see whether or not the presentation is on or not.
Hi, Shahda, it's just Chris. Yes, Louise has got the presentation up. It's live on the screen on the content slide at the moment.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you. I've just been through what we'll kind of be covering in the main. Borderlands is a new creative people and places programme covering Middlesbrough and Redcar and Cleveland. It is a 4-year funded programme with a 10-year vision. We're hosted by Teesside University and MEMA, which is the lead member of an independent consortium, which includes Tees Valley Nature Partnership, Middlesbrough Football Club Foundation, North Star Housing, Tees Valley Education, and Future Regeneration of Grangetown, who are a major community partner. Borderlands is a major programme of creative growth, which, as well as significantly increasing the number of local people taking part in cultural activity, will embed culture as part of Middlesbrough and Redcar and Cleveland's approach more broadly to health, well-being, education, placemaking, and really importantly, community resilience. So what does this actually mean? We are a resident-led programme and will be working on both large and small scales to deliver over 200,000 new opportunities for creative engagement over the next 4 years. We want to make sure that more people in our communities can experience art and culture in all its forms, and not only experience it, but make it, do it, live it, and visit it, but also to lead what that looks like, programme that activity and choose what happens and how. So this will involve working very, very closely as a community together to decide what things we want, how to make them happen, and then to actually make them happen. There are a number of key themes that underpin our approach, very much about amplifying our local stories, voices, kind of celebrating and protecting this place. I think anybody that lives in Teesside and Tees Valley more broadly will have that sense of how proud local people are to belong here. There are two key themes that we're kind of focusing on. Firstly, heritage, both in regard to the industrial heritage of both towns, as well as cultural heritage of our communities. The second, unsurprisingly, is the environment. Louise, the next slide, which is creative people and places. Thank you. Borderlands has been primarily funded by the Arts Council England, with support from Tees Valley Combined Authority, Middlesbrough and Redcar councils. This is one of the Arts Council's Creative People and Places projects. We're one of 30 similar programmes which are being delivered in 33 places across England. And these are in areas where people are significantly less than the national average involved in art and culture. Since the launch of Creative People and Places, over 5 million people across the country have engaged physically with local projects, and over almost 10.5 million have engaged virtually. And 86% of these people were not previously engaged with arts. Next slide. So, what's art and culture got to do with social recovery? I think you've already heard today about the very important role that art and culture can play in nature and social recovery. Chris from the National Recovery Network spoke earlier about how he and his team are now very much alive to the value of connecting art and culture to nature recovery. More broadly, art and culture have a significant impact on the UK's economy, education and society as a whole. In fact, art and culture contributes around 10.6 billion to the UK economy each year. But not only does this industry have a strong financial impact, the benefit of art and culture on individual and communities' well-being is undeniable. In the last year and a half, there were countless examples of how cultural organisations supported local communities. We are all aware of the significant increase in social isolation and how culture played a key part in addressing some of that, as well as the speedy move onto online activity that so many cultural organisations kind of led on. There were millions of activity packs which were distributed to communities and vulnerable children across all localities. More locally, Festival of Thrift managed to organise a socially distant, albeit on a much smaller scale, festival on a local village green. MIMA, which is Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, developed an online magazine that reached thousands during lockdown, as well as kind of distributing the activity packs and working just to keep people kind of, in touch with each other. Fundamentally, these were all opportunities for people to share stories as well as their worries, but most importantly, to connect with others. Next slide, which should be the nature slide, Louise. Thank you. You will all be familiar with the role that nature can play in social recovery. Needless to say that easy and affordable access to nature in all its form is instrumental in supporting everyone's physical and mental well-being. And I'm sure Maya, Emma and Mark will cover this in further detail shortly. Unfortunately, it is also evident that there is not equitable access for many of our communities. For those of you who attended the earlier session, you'll be aware of the work that the Natural Futures Collective has done. And as part of that, we looked at how inclusive the nature and environmental worlds are. It was unsurprising that the two least diverse professions in this country are farming and the environment. A number of speakers have already talk today about the work that has been done in relation to this, but we need to do better. And that need has now become even more urgent. Next slide. It would be really remiss of us not to talk about COVID as part of this session. The current global pandemic has had profound impact on all of us. Its most devastating impact has been the deaths of over 128,000 people in the UK, and it also continues to wreak havoc in many parts across the world. COVID has affected all of us, but it has affected some of us differently, and it has also held up a mirror to existing inequalities. Groups which experience existing disadvantages have been the hardest hit by COVID. Existing disadvantages have multiplied, intersected and layered, leaving many people firefighting on all fronts, whether that's in regards to childcare, employment, housing, vulnerability to abuse and exploitation, amongst others. Digital exclusion and food poverty have further compounded these inequalities. I think we've all heard about the kind of disproportionate impact on some communities, but though race and ethnicity have been seen as key factors in determining experience of COVID, this is not attributable just to genetic and inherent factors, but rather more to the interplay of social class, deprivation, poor housing condition, as well as systemic racism. Disabled people have been particularly severely affected by COVID-19. Their experiences have been largely invisibilized by vague references to underlying conditions. Older people, too, have had a particularly difficult time. The chances of survival diminish with age, and even for those not directly affected by the pandemic, isolation and deterioration in existing health conditions have been particular impact for this community. Needless to say, the multiple impacts on our young people will be felt for years. Also, for those with long COVID, impacts are sustained and ongoing. In an article in April 2021, Disability Rights asserted that COVID-19 has led to a huge rise in the incidence of disability amongst those affected by COVID-19. It's been reported that at least 122,000 NHS staff now have long COVID, and this will have serious long-term impact on our ability to recover, since many staff are forced to reduce their hours of work, are unable to return to work, or need time off for ongoing symptoms. 14,000 teachers have been diagnosed with long COVID, along with 30,000 social care workers. The possible, I would say, probable knock-on effects for children and vulnerable families is extremely worrying. For some, long COVID has also been associated with additional mental and other health conditions. Lancet Psychiatry reported that 1/3 of people with severe COVID-19 have gone on to be diagnosed with neurological or psychiatric conditions within 6 months. Just very quickly to talk about the disproportional, I have already mentioned some of this, the disproportional impact on some of our communities, not only locally but nationally. Firstly, low-income families with children. A recent study has found that the financial impact was significant on low-income families, with 80% of respondents reporting a significant deterioration in their living standard, largely attributable to falling income and raising expenditure. This has been the case both for those in and out of employment. Raised expenditure was due largely to costs associated with spending more time at home and included energy costs and food, both items that poorer families spend a higher proportion of their income on. Being forced to spend so much time indoors has been particularly stressful for those living in homes which were either already overcrowded and or which did not have access to outdoor space. Disabled people. Published during the week that the UK reached the milestone of 100,000 deaths from COVID-19, Disability Rights Open Letter sets out the impact of the pandemic on disabled people, highlighting that their deaths have been largely unreported and invisibilised, not least because as well as being disabled, many of those who died were elderly. 40% of deaths were in care homes. 30% of these people died either in care homes, and further 10 were taken to hospital. We hear that care home residents are older people, as if that somehow mitigates their deaths. Older people in care homes are often disabled, whether that's through age, dementia, sensory impairment, and physical or learning disabilities. These people were disabled, as well as kind of vulnerable in so many ways. And without making any political points, many of them need not have died. According to the data from the Office of National Statistics, 59% of deaths have been those of disabled. LGBTQ+. The LGBT Foundation conducted its own research, Hidden Figures, which sought to assess the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTQ+ communities. It showed wide-ranging negative impacts on individuals' physical and mental well-being, including increased feelings of isolation, and for young people who have been forced to move back home, stresses associated with being confined with families who might be homophobic or transphobic, or who were unaware of that young person's sexuality. 42% of respondents stated they would like to access more or access mental health services. Older people. And again, research by Age UK kind of highlights how the impact on older people has been particularly severe. In addition to kind of severe ill health and death, there have been other kind of directly reported issues of low mood, lack of support, deteriorating physical health, and increased pain, partly due to the non-availability of formal and informal health care. Right, this brings me on to Black, Asian and ethnic diverse people. I think we're all aware of the disproportionate impact on ethnic minorities, which were apparent during the first wave and continuing for some groups during the second wave, and it is a matter of continuing concern. Research carried out by the charity Turn to Us revealed that 58% of Black and Asian and ethnically diverse workers employment has been affected by COVID-19 compared to 47% of white workers. I touched upon issues of low-income families, but more broadly, working class people. They, as a definition, are a multiracial group, though, kind of many reports have argued that structural and systemic kind of issues, inequalities can layer and compound the impact of COVID-19. Many of these communities are more likely to work in jobs outside of the home, more likely to be key workers, less likely to have been supplied with adequate PPE, and more likely to live in overcrowded housing and have less financial capabilities. Men and women, both men and women have been seriously affected in different ways. The Women's Resource Centre reported that at the beginning of the pandemic, the National Domestic Abuse Line saw a 25% increase in online requests since lockdown began. It was further reported by the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales that the number of women killed by men had risen to the highest it had been for 11 years. There were 16 domestic homicides within the first 3 weeks of lockdown, whose victims included 6 children. Home, a place to which of many of us were confined for much of the lockdown, was for women and many children of at least safe space. How between March 2020 and January 2021, 63,000 men died of COVID-19 compared to 53,000 women. However, COVID-19 has had a much more negative impact on women's well-being than men. This may be partly due to the unequal allocation of housework, etc., but also childcare. I think at the beginning of lockdown in March 2020, women spent 55% more time on unpaid childcare. By October 2020, women were spending more than 99% of their time on unpaid childcare. The burden of homeschooling, too, fell disproportionately on women's shoulders. At the beginning of the pandemic, just over a third of women reported that their well-being was negatively being impacted compared to 20% of men. These kind of issues around anxiety and mental well-being have just risen throughout, and I think this is going to continue for the foreseeable future. In conclusion, not only do we need to build back better, we have to build back differently. And I think it's important to reflect that normal wasn't that great for everyone. There's a lot of talk about a just transition in regard to nature recovery. I think that also has to be applied to social recovery. We have to tackle poverty and reduce inequalities and take a human rights-based approach to this and look at how nature recovery can be central. In short, we need actions, not words, and as well as representation at all levels and everywhere. Be prepared to have some difficult conversations and to listen and to learn. Thank you.